oil in particular.
You know, guys, it wasn't all that long ago that peak oil was simply an extremist view, but the militaries of the world now seem to be taking it very seriously. In fact, they're the ones driving the research because they realize the potential impact on economies, on maintaining a stable society, on exposing weaknesses in enemies, and for identifying where geopolitical power shifts may occur, frankly. It goes so far beyond filling up at the pump, and it's absolutely essential to this pyramid scheme.
Last year, the U.S. Joint Force Command released a study warning of a coming oil crisis that could begin any minute now. They think this could be the year surplus global oil production entirely disappears. And by 2015, we may be coming up 10 million barrels short every day. But they're really only focusing on crude oil, not the alternative oil forms.
The investigation that caught my attention was the one from Germany's Federal Defense Force. This draft was never meant to be seen by the public, but in fact it was leaked. I thought it was a game changer. This report predicted that a future of dwindling oil supplies could lead to dramatic shifts in the global balance of power and a decline in the importance of the Western industrial nations. That means us. They predicted that peak oil could bring about a total collapse of the financial markets, and serious social, political, and economic crises could strike the entire world. If people were looking for a wake-up call, this wasn't a bad one.
You know what? Germany's findings were certainly the ones that garnered the most attention, but the UK also reached similar conclusions. We know their Ministry of Defense, Bank of England, and the Department of Energy were all holding secret talks about peak oil. It is something that is way beyond the realm of conspiracy theories these days, and Americans need to prepare for it, but they also need to understand it further. Here's a quick breakdown on peak oil. It's a theory that began in the mid-1950s from a man named Marion Hubbert. Hubbert was a geoscientist who worked at the Shell Research Lab in Houston, Texas. His peak oil theory refers to the point in time where the world is unable to increase the supply of oil brought to the market because there just isn't as much to be extracted from the ground anymore. It's not a matter of running out. Let me be clear about that. But it is a matter of slowing down. The fact is, world oil discoveries peaked in the 1960s. And that while we kept producing more and more oil in the decades after the so-called peak, it became just a matter of extracting more oil at a faster rate than we were finding it. Some organizations now believe we may have already passed the peak in the amount of oil we can bring out of the ground from those very wells. Take the International Energy Agency, the IEA. Their data shows that the world may have begun to reach peak oil production around 2006. The IEA's chief economist even stated that one day we will run out of oil. Not today or tomorrow, but one day we will run out of oil. So we have to leave oil before oil leaves us. Many Americans believe we've become a net exporter of oil, and it's a very big misconception. And that's possibly why the situation isn't getting the attention it deserves. Here's the reality. We are a net exporter of oil-based products. There's a big difference between that and being a net exporter of oil itself. That just means our refineries are shipping out more and more gasoline and other products than we take in. But it's still oil we imported in the first place that we are refining and then turning around and exporting back out. The hard truth is we are very soon going to be living in a world of very expensive oil. There was a meeting last year that included some high-ranking U.S. government and military officials. One of the participants was the National Security Advisor for President George W. Bush. He proposed a simple question. How did we let this happen? We've known we were dependent on oil for 20 years, and everybody's been talking about energy independence. How come we're at this point?
Now, if you want to know why there aren't many of the powers that be taking the peak oil situation too seriously, look at OPEC. I believe they are blatantly lying to the public about how much oil they have in their reserves. We know that while America and much of the world was seeing its production slow down back in the 1980s, somehow the Saudis were able to magically increase their proven oil reserves by as much as 127%. But here's the thing, nobody audits OPEC, but OPEC. People can say what they want about WikiLeaks, but one thing that website may have done was expose some very dirty secrets about peak oil in the Middle East. There were no less than 4 cables that were uncovered between the U.S. Embassy and Saudi officials that suggested that Saudi oil reserves were being overestimated by as much as 40%. And that peak oil is imminent.
The WikiLeaks weren't the only warnings of this. Oxford University believes OPEC has been overestimating the reserves by 1/3, and that we could enter into an oil crisis by 2014 when supply can't keep up with demand.
It's no mystery why Oxford sees a crisis looming. If you are to believe OPEC, then they have about 2.5 times the amount of oil in their reserves than the rest of the world combined. Just imagine the impact if they're doctoring those numbers. We could be talking about 426 billion barrels of crude oil, 13 years worth of oil for the entire planet, not just the Middle East, gone, up in smoke.
I was recently at Windsor Palace in England meeting with UK ministers and ambassadors from 12 countries, and I explained that we have a very serious energy situation on our hands. It's not one to be taken lightly. But I will tell you without any reservations that the extremists' view on peak oil is built on a myth. We won't go to sleep one night in an oil-rich nation and wake up the next day and it'll all be gone. The U.S. Geological Survey estimates we have about 2 trillion barrels of oil yet to be discovered. They believe that'll last us 70 years at current consumption rates. Now, the caveat to that is the idea of current consumption rates. With what we are seeing in China and the emerging markets, 70 years may be overshooting how long oil will last by a bit, but we won't go dry anytime soon. Here's the real situation. We have long reached and passed the days of easy and cheap oil. What we are doing to cope is transitioning from more traditional crude oil, the cheap stuff, to the unconventional forms like shale, bitumen, and oil sands. This stuff is much more expensive and energy intensive to get out of the ground and bring to the market, and it eventually means dramatically higher costs. We've got a race against time on our hands here, and we aren't going to win. What I'm about to say I was recently told directly by multiple ambassadors from the Gulf Coordination Council in a private meeting. They represent the oil interests of the Persian Gulf. So we're talking OPEC folks here. They told me that by 2014 they have to have a minimum, I want to stress minimum price, of $125 a barrel to maintain their economies in the Middle East. So without any other factors in play, that'll be the lowest oil can ever go again. But we know that there are always other factors that come into the oil game. So my take is that $150 a barrel will be the new norm very soon. What I mean by that is, we'll hit a point where regardless of whatever economic pullbacks and events take place, that will be the lowest price oil ever drops to. And that time is not that far off.
I'll one up you, Kent. I think we could hit $200 a barrel, although we could see some quick panics if Iran decides to play geopolitical Russian roulette and blocks the Strait of Hormuz, for example. Or even worse yet, they break out into open conflict with Israel. Don't forget a terrorist attack hitting an OPEC nation could have big implications for America, too. That could lead to temporary gas lines, dramatically inflated prices in the short term. And then $200 a barrel is going to look like roses compared to reality.
The solutions we hear politicians and so-called energy experts talk about on TV never take into account one alarming trend that's been getting worse and worse over the last century: the ratio of energy return on energy invested. Energy return on energy invested, or EROEI for short, simply measures how much energy it takes to get energy out of the ground. In the 1930s, you could get about 100 barrels of oil out of the ground for every 1 barrel you used. By 1970, that figure was 25 barrels to 1. Today, we're only getting about 3, maybe 5 barrels of oil for every 1 barrel of energy we use to extract it. It's another exponential growth curve. And what's unfortunate is that this trend is not likely to improve regardless of where we choose to drill, whether it's Alaska or the Gulf of Mexico. And as an oil guy, it pains me to say that. So if we find out we have some untapped treasure trove of oil somewhere deep underground, it will still be incredibly expensive to get it simply because of this EROEI ratio.
It's undeniable that the United States conventional crude oil production peaked in 1970. 48 other countries saw similar peak oil situations, including Indonesia, which used to be an OPEC member. We just don't get the major oil finds anymore like we used to. The press went crazy when another big oil well was discovered in the Campos Basin in Brazil. As much as 250 million barrels of oil are believed to be there, but that would represent a fraction of what we found in oil's heyday. The Tupi oil field, also in Brazil, is a similar story. Now, Some of the unconventional forms of oil are certainly getting a lot of press. Look at shale oil. At first glance, it's pretty exciting. In just the last 3 years alone, Texas has seen a 230-fold increase in their output of crude oil that's derived from shale. That's about a 23,000% spike. It's mostly coming from the Eagle Ford Basin. Unfortunately, the Eagle Ford Basin is believed to have only a total of 3 billion barrels of oil for discovery. And similar big shale formations in the Bakken in North Dakota can only deliver about 128 million barrels a year. It's small potatoes compared to what we used to find.
Here's another way to look at it. Global oil consumption is now about 89 million barrels a day. So we could theoretically use up all of the annual production of these big fields in 2 to 3 days. So we better hope there are trillions of barrels of crude oil lying under the water in the Arctic if we are going to place our chips down on oil for the long term. And that isn't a very safe bet at the prices oil is going to hit in the coming years.
Here's the thing. If more of the American public ask themselves two questions: one, what happens when oil becomes too expensive because the easy stuff just isn't lying there under the surface to grab? And two, what happens if we aren't prepared for it? They might be much more worried about their futures because this crisis will put more of a strain on the already dangerous exponential growth patterns that are present in our economy and our environment. And this will cause the data of the pyramid scheme's ultimate collapse to speed up.
The team has made its case that we are in for some hard times regarding oil. But maybe you're holding out hope for an alternative source of energy to sweep in and replace it. We'll discuss that next. But remember, you just can't flip a switch and transition to a new type of energy. It can require tens of trillions of dollars of investments in infrastructure and technology. And it's never been done quickly. Consider this. It took about 100 years to transition from wood being the primary energy resource to coal, and then another 100 years for coal to be overtaken by oil in 1964. So what viable replacements for oil exist? And until one steps up, will an energy crisis play a role in this pyramid scheme theory the team has presented? Find out ahead. But first, let me say that we are going to cover a lot of ground today. This is a very serious subject, and you deserve the real story. Energy is just our first topic. We're also going to review potentially catastrophic exponential growth patterns in our environment and economy. And don't worry about remembering every point made here today, because at the conclusion of this investigation, we will show you how to claim a 100% free package that documents all of the findings presented today, an eye-opening book you must read, plus a collection of time-sensitive briefings that reveal the options you have moving forward for your investments, life savings, and finances.
Outside of wind and solar, the renewable energy sources don't offer the kinds of EROEI returns that we need to A, meet our exponential growth demands for energy, and B, fuel continued exponential growth in our environment and economy. But solar and wind are impractical for mass adoption and will continue to be for a very long time. Plus, neither gives us liquid fuels, no matter how high their EROEI ratio is. And liquid fuels are what we most need to run our economy. Methanol and biodiesel can't cut it either. And ethanol is so inefficient in many cases, it takes as much energy to produce as it actually contains.
We're going to be forced to lean on a lot of inefficient energy sources in the future, including oil. Take the Keystone Pipeline. The oil coming out of that is primarily from the tar sands. The EROEI for that is around 2.9, which is highly inefficient compared to what we used to get.
Coal is an interesting story too. We produce a lot of it, that's for sure. So much so that there are some experts who want us to believe that we have 250 years of it left in the United States alone. But you have to dig deeper than that. We are barely mining the high quality